The wind was a thief in this high, desolate country, stealing the warmth from the rough-hewn logs of the cabin and the very breath from a person's lungs. It was the only sound Eliza had tolerated for months, a constant morning wail that echoed the hollow space inside her own chest. The cabin, built by Jacob's hands, had become her tomb. Every plank, every nail, was a monument to a life that had ended and another that had never begun. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of autumn light, illuminating the emptiness. The cradle Jacob had carved, its runner smooth and hopeful, sat vacant in the corner, a cruel testament to her barren womb. Grief was a physical presence, a cold cloak she could not shrug off. It sat with her at the small table, lay beside her in the cold bed, and looked back at her from her own reflection in the murky windowpane. She was a ghost in her own life, tethered to this place by the memory of a man and the failure of her own body. Despair was the bitter taste of the water from the well, the ache in her bones that had nothing to do with the coming winter. The world had shrunk to these four walls and the vast, indifferent sky arching over the jagged peaks of the Warner Mountains. The silence was absolute, a crushing weight that amplified the sound of her own heart beating a lonely, futile rhythm. Tonight, the wind had teeth. It gnawed at the cabin, rattling the door in its frame as if demanding entry. Rain began to lash against the glass, hard as flung pebbles. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter, staring into the meager fire. The flames cast long, dancing shadows that twisted the familiar shapes of the room into monstrous forms. It was in the midst of this rising tempest, a maelstrom without matching the one within, that a new sound broke the monotony of her sorrow. A sharp, insistent rap on the door. It was not the wind. It was a fist. Fear, cold and immediate, pierced through the fog of her grief. No one came here. The nearest settlement was a day's ride, and no sane traveler would be out in this weather. Jacob's rifle was still mounted over the hearth, but she hadn't touched it since the day she'd laid him in the ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She froze, listening. The rapping came again, louder this time, a sound of desperate urgency that overrode the howl of the storm. Slowly, her limbs stiff and unwilling, she rose. Her hand trembled as she reached for the iron latch, the cold of it a shock to her skin. She did not know what waited on the other side, but a strange, fatalistic certainty settled over her. Whatever it was, it could be no worse than the suffocating emptiness she was already living in. She drew the bolt. The man who stood on her doorstep seemed to have been carved from the mountain itself. He was immense, a Modoc warrior whose frame filled the entire doorway, blocking out the churning chaos of the storm. Rain slicked his bare, powerful shoulders and plastered his long black hair to his face. Water dripped from the leather fringe of his breechcloth onto her clean-swept floor. In the flickering firelight, his features were stark planes and hard angles, his eyes dark and unreadable. He was the embodiment of the wild, untamed land she so feared. But it was not his size or his fierce appearance that held her paralyzed. It was what he held in his arms. Swaddled in a thick, wet fur was a bundle, and from it came a sound that tore through Eliza's soul with the force of a physical blow. A thin, wavering cry. The cry of a newborn baby. The warrior's gaze met hers, and in their depths, she saw no threat, no malice. She saw the same raw desperation that clawed at the edges of her own world. He took a half-step forward, into the relative warmth of her cabin, and the scent of wet earth, pine, and rain filled the small space. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply held out the crying bundle, an offering and a plea in one stark, silent gesture. The infant's cry was the sound of a life hanging by the most slender of threads, a sound that demanded an answer in a world that had offered Eliza nothing but silence. The warrior, Cale, did not move from his position just inside the door, a sentinel of silent desperation. The only sound from him was the slow, controlled measure of his breath. All other noise was consumed by the infant's cries, thin, ragged, and full of a terror that spoke of hunger and cold. Eliza stared, her mind a maelstrom of shock and disbelief. A baby. Here. In her house of silence and sorrow. The man's eyes never left her face, his expression a mask of stoicism that could not entirely conceal the raw plea beneath. He gestured with his chin toward the bundle, then made a motion with his hand to his own chest, then to the infant, a simple, universal language of need. He was the father. The baby was starving. A bitter, hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up from Eliza's throat. Him, coming to her? The barren woman, the failed wife whose body was a graveyard of unspoken hopes. It was a cruelty the likes of which she could not have imagined. The universe, it seemed, had a vicious sense of irony. She shook her head, a small, tight gesture of refusal. "I can't," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You don't understand. I have no. I cannot." She couldn't bring herself to say the word. Milk. The word itself was a condemnation. The baby's cry hitched, turning into a desperate, gasping whimper that lanced through Eliza's heart. It was a sound that bypassed reason, that spoke to an instinct she thought had long since withered and died within her. The man, Cale, seemed to understand her denial, but his gaze did not waver. He took another deliberate step, closing the distance between them. He unwrapped a portion of the fur, revealing the infant's tiny, wizened face, its skin tinged with a faint blue, its mouth opening and closing in a frantic, fruitless search. It was so small, so utterly helpless. The sight shattered the last of Eliza's resistance. The empty cradle in the corner seemed to mock her. The silence she had cultivated for months was a sin against this small, struggling life. What did her own pain matter in the face of this? What was her barrenness compared to this immediate, desperate need? Her mother, a woman of herbs and folk wisdom, had once spoken of such things, of a witch's teat, a woman who could will milk for a babe in need. It was old-world nonsense, she'd thought. A fable. But looking at the child, a flicker of something, not hope, but a desperate, defiant resolve ignited in the cold ruin of her soul. She could at least offer warmth. She could at least try. With a deep, shuddering breath that felt like her first in an age, she nodded. The warrior's shoulders sagged in a barely perceptible wave of relief. Eliza held out her arms, the gesture unfamiliar and stiff. "Give him to me," she said, her voice stronger now. He carefully transferred the precious, fragile bundle into her embrace. The baby was impossibly light, yet felt heavier than the weight of her entire world. Its skin was cold, its tiny body trembling. As she held him close, his frantic mouth found the coarse wool of her dress, rooting against her chest. A profound, aching sorrow, so deep and vast it eclipsed her own, washed over her. This was not her child, but in that moment, its survival was the only thing that mattered. The first days were a kind of waking nightmare, a blur of exhaustion and fear. The baby, whom she thought of only as a child, rarely slept for more than a few minutes at a time, his cries a constant, raw-edged saw against her nerves. Eliza moved as if in a trance, her world shrinking to the primal cycle of warmth, water, and desperate attempts at feeding. She followed the half-remembered law of her mother, brewing teas from blessed thistle and fenugreek, forcing the bitter liquids down her own throat until she gagged. She held the child to her breast for hours, his frantic, hungry mouth causing a sharp, chafing pain, yet yielding nothing. With each failed attempt, a wave of familiar inadequacy washed over her. She was a fraud. A dry well pretending to be a spring. Her body was betraying this child just as it had betrayed her and Jacob. Despair was a constant, whispering companion. Several times, she was tempted to give up, to hand the child back to the silent warrior and retreat into the familiar solace of her grief. But then the baby would let out a particularly pitiful cry, or his tiny, perfect hand would fist in the fabric of her dress, and the resolve would harden in her belly once more. She would not fail him. She could not. While she waged this internal and external war, Cale was a silent, ever-present force. He moved with a quiet economy that seemed to shrink his giant frame to fit the confines of the small cabin. He never intruded, never offered advice, but his absence would have been immediately felt. Each morning, a stack of freshly chopped wood appeared by the door, enough to keep the fire roaring against the autumn chill. A skinned rabbit or a brace of grouse would be left on the chopping block, a silent offering of sustenance. He repaired the loose shutter the storm had damaged, his large hands surprisingly deft. He would sit for long stretches by the fire, sharpening a knife or mending a piece of leather, his presence a steady, grounding weight in the turbulent atmosphere of the cabin. He never looked directly at her while she struggled with the child, affording her a strange kind of privacy. Yet she felt his awareness, his gaze resting on the fire but his senses tuned to the small drama unfolding on the rocking chair. His stillness was not empty, it was watchful. It was the patience of the hunter, the calm of the mountain. He was waiting, just as she was. He had placed his son's life in her hands, a trust so absolute it was terrifying. His faith in her was a heavier burden than her own doubt, and it was this, more than anything, that kept her going. She was tethered to this man and his child by a fragile thread of necessity, a bond woven in silence and desperation, in a language that had no need for words. It happened on the fourth day. The sun, a rare visitor, had broken through the clouds, casting a pale, watery light into the cabin. Eliza was sitting in the rocking chair, the rhythmic creak of the runners the only sound besides the child's weak whimpers. She was exhausted, her hope worn down to a nub. She had tried everything, the tease, the compresses, the endless, painful latching. Nothing. She was about to pull away, to admit defeat, when she felt a subtle, unfamiliar tingling deep within her breast. It was a faint, ghost of a sensation, but it was there. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced her. She held her breath, pressing the baby closer. His desperate mouth worked, and then, a change. A different rhythm. A small, convulsive swallow. Then another. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. She looked down, her heart hammering. The child had gone still, his tiny body mold against hers, his mouth working with a quiet, focused intensity. It was happening. A slow, miraculous trickle, a release she had believed her body incapable of. It was not a gush, not an abundance, but it was something. It was life. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a hot path down her cheek. It was a tear of relief so profound it felt like absolution. All the years of silent shame, of feeling broken and incomplete, seemed to fall away in that instant. Her body, the vessel of her sorrow, had become a source of sustenance. It was a miracle born of stubbornness and desperation. The child suckled, his earlier frenzy replaced by a contented calm. His eyes, dark and deep like his father's, fluttered closed. For the first time, he was at peace. Eliza looked up, her gaze drawn across the room. Cale was standing by the hearth, motionless. He had been watching, after all. His face, usually an unreadable mask of stone, was softened. His dark eyes were fixed on her and the child, and in their depths, she saw a universe of emotion, gratitude, relief, and a profound, aching tenderness that mirrored her own. He gave a single, slow nod. It was a gesture of immense significance, a confirmation of the pact they had made, a silent acknowledgement of the miracle she had wrought. In that shared, silent moment, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted irrevocably. It was no longer her tomb of grief and his temporary shelter. It was a sanctuary. The three of them, the barren widow, the grieving warrior, and the fragile new life, were bound together not just by need, but by a shared, unspoken victory against the encroaching darkness. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, a domesticity so strange and unexpected it felt like a dream. The child, whom she now called Little Bear in the privacy of her own mind for the fierce way he'd clung to life, grew stronger. His cries became less about desperation and more about demand, his cheeks filled out, and a fine cap of black hair began to cover his scalp. Eliza's life, once empty and silent, was now filled with the small, essential tasks of motherhood. She washed swaddling clothes in a basin of hot water, humming tuneless melodies she hadn't thought of in years. The rocking chair was no longer a place of idle grief but of active comfort, its gentle motion a lullaby for the child nestled against her heart. With each feeding, the bond deepened. She learned the specific pitch of his hungry cry versus his tired one. She marveled at the tiny perfection of his fingers, the way they would curl around one of hers with surprising strength. The gaping wound of her infertility, the central, defining pain of her existence, began to heal over with the balm of this new purpose. She was no longer Eliza, the barren widow. She was the source of life for this child. This new identity was fragile, borrowed, and yet it felt more real than anything she had ever been. Her awareness of Cale shifted as well. He was no longer just a stoic, intimidating presence. She began to see the father. She watched the way his large, calloused hands would gently adjust the fur wrap around the sleeping baby, his touch infinitely careful. She saw the lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, the deep well of sorrow that he kept hidden behind his stoic facade. He was a man hollowed out by his own loss, the nature of which she could only guess at. The baby's mother was a silent ghost between them, a question Eliza would never ask and a pain he would never voice. But his grief was there, in the way he would sometimes stare out the window toward the distant, hazy shape of Tule Lake, his expression lost and remote. His silence was not one of coldness, but of a sorrow too vast for words. He continued to provide for them with a quiet efficiency that was its own form of care. He was the wall that stood between their small, warm sanctuary and the harsh indifference of the world outside. He was the guardian of their fragile peace, a peace he had sought out and entrusted to her. One evening, as she rocked Little Bear by the fire, Cale sat across from her, carving a piece of soft pine wood. She watched his knife move, peeling away thin curls of wood with practiced ease. He was not making a tool or an arrowhead. Under his patient hands, the block of wood was slowly taking the shape of a small, smooth bird, its wings half spread as if in flight. It was a toy. A gift for his son. The simple, tender gesture spoke volumes, a quiet declaration of love and hope in the face of all they had lost. One afternoon, as a crisp autumn wind stripped the last of the yellow leaves from the aspen grove by the creek, Eliza was outside, hanging the baby's washed clothes on a line strung between two pines. The air was clean and sharp, and the scent of wood smoke from the cabin's chimney was a comforting reassurance. Little Bear was asleep inside, bundled warmly in the cradle. For the first time in a long time, Eliza felt a sense of peace settle deep in her bones. The landscape no longer seemed merely hostile, it held a stark, challenging beauty. She was no longer just surviving in it, she was living. As she worked, Cale emerged from the woods, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He stopped a short distance away, watching her. There was a new quality to his gaze, a quiet contemplation. He walked toward her, not to the cabin, but to the line where she stood pinning a small cloth. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled something out. He held it forth on his open palm. It was a single, perfect eagle feather, its edge a clean, sharp line of white against the dark gray. It was a thing of power and sacredness, she knew that much. A gift of profound meaning. She looked from the feather to his face, her heart suddenly beating faster. "For me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. His eyes held hers, and in them, she saw respect. Gratitude. A connection that ran deeper than their shared task. This was not a payment. It was an acknowledgement. An honor. Carefully, she took the feather from his hand, her fingers brushing against his warm, calloused skin. The contact sent a small jolt through her. It was the first time they had touched for any reason other than the transfer of the child. The feather was light as air but felt immensely heavy with significance. She didn't know the specific customs of his people, but she understood the weight of this. He was thanking her not just for the milk, but for the care, for the sanctuary, for seeing his son not as a burden but as a gift. He then looked toward the cabin, where his son slept peacefully, and a flicker of deep, raw emotion crossed his face. It was the look of a father whose greatest treasure was safe. He turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time, his lips curved into the barest hint of a smile. It transformed his harsh features, revealing a warmth she had only glimpsed before. He said nothing, and he did not need to. In that silent exchange, with the feather resting in her palm and the scent of pine in the air, their pact was sealed anew. They were no longer just a woman and a man bound by necessity. They were allies. A strange, solitary clan of three, standing together against the world. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered by the arrival of horses. It was a cold, grey morning, the sky the color of lead. Eliza was stirring porridge at the hearth when the sound of hoofbeats and men's voices broke the stillness. Her blood ran cold. These were not the sounds of a lone rider, it was a party. Cale, who had been mending a snowshoe by the window, went utterly still. His eyes narrowed, and with a single, fluid motion, he rose and moved to the side of the door, melting into the shadows like a panther. He was no longer the quiet father, he was the warrior, alert and dangerous. A sharp rap came at the door, arrogant and demanding. "Eliza Miller," a man's voice called out. "I know you're in there. Open up." "This is a matter of property." Eliza's heart pounded against her ribs. She glanced at Cale, whose expression was grim. He gave a minute shake of his head. "Do not open it." The man outside was Mr. Davies, a land agent from the settlement who had approached Jacob once about selling. A greedy, officious man with pale, grasping eyes. "Mrs. Miller," his voice came again, laced with impatience. "Your husband is gone. This claim is unimproved and falls under the reversionary clause. The company I represent is prepared to take possession." Lies. Jacob had filed the deed properly. But she was a woman alone. A vulnerable target. Then, another voice, rougher, called out. "Hey, Davies, I see smoke. And there's Injun sign all over this place." A chill of a different kind washed over Eliza. This was not just about the land. This was about Cale. This was about the town's simmering hatred and fear of the Modoc people, a fear that had festered since the war. To them, Cale was not a grieving father. He was a savage, a threat to be eliminated. Davies' voice lowered, but she could still hear the venom in it. "Is that right? Well, that complicates things for her, doesn't it? Harboring a redskin fugitive." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and deadly. Eliza clutched the iron ladle in her hand, her knuckles white. The cradle, where little Bear slept, was blessedly silent. The world she and Cale had built within these four walls was about to be torn apart by the ignorance and cruelty of the world outside. She was not just a widow to them, she was a conspirator, a traitor to her own kind. The fragile web of their found family was caught in the crosshairs of greed and prejudice, and the walls of her cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a trap. "I'll give you till sundown, Mrs. Miller," Davies shouted, his voice receding slightly as he must have turned back to his horse. "You get that buck out of there and vacate the premises. If you don't, we'll be back with the marshal, and it won't be a polite conversation." The sound of their horses faded, leaving a silence that was more terrifying than the noise had been. The threat lingered, thick and poisonous as smoke. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling. She looked at Cale. He stepped away from the door, his face a mask of cold fury. The protective stillness he usually held had been replaced by a coiled tension, the promise of violence held in check. He knew, as she did, that Davies had no intention of bringing the marshal. Men like him preferred their own brutal form of justice, especially on the frontier, far from prying eyes. Sundown. The word was a death sentence. Her gaze fell on the rifle above the hearth. She had never fired it. She didn't even know if she could. But the sight of it no longer filled her with sorrow for Jacob, it filled her with a grim determination. This cabin was not just wooden nails anymore. It was her home. It was Little Bear's home. She had fought to bring forth life within these walls, and she would not let it be extinguished by the greed of lesser men. Cale's eyes met hers across the room. He saw the resolve hardening in her face. He walked to the hearth, his movement silent and deliberate. He did not reach for the rifle. Instead, his hand went to the small deerskin pouch at his hip. He was checking his own implements, his own means of defense. He looked at her, then gave a sharp, definitive nod toward the cradle. The message was clear. Protect the child. Then he gestured to the windows, to the door. He was thinking, planning, assessing their defenses. In that moment, a profound shift occurred within Eliza. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective rage. These men saw her as a weak, helpless widow. They saw Cale as a savage. They saw a plot of land and an obstacle. They did not see the truth. They did not see the family that had been forged here in the crucible of loss and survival. She went to the window, peering out from behind the curtain. The grey sky was darkening, the clouds growing heavy. It looked like snow. A storm was coming, both inside and out. She would not run. This was her ground. She had found her purpose here, her strength. She would stand with the silent warrior who had trusted her with his son's life. They would face the darkness together. The hours until sundown bled away, each tick of the clock in Eliza's mind a step closer to the inevitable. The sky fulfilled its promise, and a light, dry snow began to fall, whispering against the window panes. It would cover the men's tracks and muffle the sounds of their approach. Cale worked with a silent, focused intensity. He barred the door not just with the iron latch but with a heavy log brace. He checked the seal on the shutters, leaving only the smallest cracks to see through. He did not speak, but his actions were a language she now understood fluently. Prepare. Endure. Fight. Eliza, for her part, moved with a newfound purpose. She took down Jacob's rifle. Her hands, which had trembled at the thought of it before, were now steady. She checked the ammunition, her movements methodical. She stoked the fire until it roared, not just for warmth, but as an act of defiance against the encroaching cold and darkness. She filled every pot and bucket with water. And in the center of it all, Little Bear slept, oblivious, his soft breaths a stark contrast to the coiled tension filling the cabin. He was the heart of their fortress, the reason for this stand. As dusk settled, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of blue and gray, Cale took his position near the door, a heavy war club resting in his hand. He was a figure of immense, patient power, seeming to merge with the shadows. Eliza took her place by the far window, the heavy rifle resting on the sill. The weight of it was unfamiliar, but solid. Reassuring. The cabin was silent, the air thick with anticipation. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of waiting. Outside, the world was hushed by the falling snow. Then, they heard it. A crunch of snow, then another. They were here. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat, but she gripped the rifle tighter, pressing her cheek against the cold wood of the stock. Through the crack in the shutter, she could see them, Davies and two other men, moving like wraiths through the twilight. They were on foot, having left their horses tethered in the trees. They carried rifles and a heavy lantern that cast a sickly yellow glow. Miller. Davies' voice was a low snarl, stripped of its earlier civility. Last chance. Send out the savage and come out with your hands up. Eliza did not answer. Her gaze was fixed on the man's silhouette. Beside her, she could feel Cale's stillness, a concentration of energy so profound it was almost a physical force. The men spread out, flanking the cabin. One of them moved toward the window where she was stationed. He raised his rifle but, preparing to smash the glass. Without thinking, without allowing fear to intervene, Eliza fired. The rifle's roar was deafening in the enclosed space, the kick of it jarring her shoulder. The bullet slammed into the log wall just beside the man's head, sending splinters flying. He yelled in shock and scrambled back, falling into the snow. It was a warning. The first word in a terrible conversation. The night exploded into chaos. A shot from outside shattered the other window, sending a spray of glass and freezing air into the cabin. Cale moved, a blur of motion in the firelight. He was not at the door anymore. He was a shadow, using the cabin's darkness as his ally. Another man tried to force the door, throwing his weight against it. The log brace held firm. As the man recoiled for another attempt, the door was suddenly flung open from the inside. Cale was there, a terrifying apparition framed against the firelight. He moved with impossible speed, his club a blur. There was a sickening thud, a cry of pain, and the man went down. Cale was outside, a whirlwind of controlled violence in the falling snow. Eliza, her ears ringing, reloaded the rifle, her hands moving with a desperate, learned grace. She saw Davies aiming, not at the fighting Cale, but at the cabin door. At her. She fired again, this time not as a warning. The shot caught Davies in the shoulder, spinning him around with a scream of rage and pain. The third man, seeing Cale fell his partner and Davies go down, lost his nerve. He turned and fled, disappearing into the snowy darkness. Cale stood over the two groaning men on the ground. He did not kill them. He disarmed them, his movements economical and decisive. He looked at Davies, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. Cale pointed back toward the settlement, his meaning clear. Go. And do not return. He watched as they staggered to their feet, supporting each other as they stumbled away into the night, their failed greed swallowed by the storm. Cale stepped back inside the cabin, closing and barring the door. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the hiss of the fire and the whimpering cry of Little Bear, finally woken by the violence. The smell of gunpowder and cold air filled the room. Cale was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling. A thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where a splinter must have caught him. Eliza put the rifle down, her entire body trembling with the adrenaline of the fight. Her shoulder ached fiercely. But she was unharmed. They were safe. She went to the cradle and lifted Little Bear, holding him close, murmuring words of comfort. His cries subsided into hiccups as he nestled against her. She looked at Cale, who was watching her, his dark eyes intense in the firelight. He had fought for them. He had defended their home. And she, the woman who had once been paralyzed by grief and fear, had fought alongside him. She had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, a ferocity born of a mother's protective instinct. She carried the baby and went to Cale. Without a word, she took a clean cloth from a nearby table, dipped it in the water basin, and gently began to clean the cut on his forehead. He stood perfectly still under her touch, his gaze never leaving her face. The silence in the room was no longer one of tension or sorrow, but of deep, resonant understanding. They had faced the worst of the outside world and had won. Their bond, forged in quiet desperation, had been tempered in the fire of conflict. It was unbreakable now. As she finished, her hand lingered for a moment on his cheek. He was no longer a stranger, no longer a mysterious warrior. He was her partner. He was family. He slowly raised his hand and covered hers, his large, warm fingers gently closing around her own. He then looked down at the child cradled in her other arm, his expression softening into one of pure, unadulterated love. His gaze lifted back to hers, and he spoke. His voice was low, the English words careful and deliberate, learned perhaps in captivity or trade, but spoken now with a new and profound weight. He pointed a single finger, first at the child, then at her. "Mother," he said. The word was simple. It was quiet. But it landed with the force of a revelation, rewriting her entire existence. It was not just a name for the child to use someday. It was his acknowledgement. His declaration. In his eyes, and in the eyes of this child, she was not the barren widow. She was not a temporary convenience. She was mother. A single, joyful tear, wholly different from all the tears of sorrow she had ever shed, traced a path down her cheek. She was home.